take
I
the
think,
thought.
by the way, I've also asked you about writing a song before, and you told me about the song for Juliana, but never that concisely, so that's
Okay,
good to have.
all right, and then
You
there's
should
the
put that
Isabel.
up somewhere and link to it, too.
Huh?
You should
Yeah.
put that up. Eventually,
Yeah,
you can do all this
we'll
stuff.
put it up.
What's it called?
Juliana.
Oh.
And then there's Isabella, which took
The authors of the
authors.
famous O.M.Z.
You never, actually, you should listen. You'll just get a kick out of listening to Juliana. And Isabella
to hear
was
it.
a great, I actually is one of my favorite songs. Juliana was great too, but musically, Isabella. Hold on.
95 bottles.
Yeah, no, I'm just reading the lyrics just to try and get a take on it. Can you play 95 bottles just for a second? I just want to hear the hook. Just, I don't need to hear the whole thing.
It's the second song on the first CD.
Get the CDs.
Oh, sorry, yes, right here. I thought this one had here. So it's this is the second track here. Thanks. It's so funny when you don't listen to this for a long time and then you listen to it again, you hear all sorts of other things you hadn't heard before.
I'm so
It's
happy
so-
that you said
You
Joe
look
Lynn.
so happy to be talking about, oh, Joe Lynn, I know.
That was-
Well, I admit when I'm wrong, I'm
No,
wrong. But it was the visual that I couldn't get.
No, it's interesting. It's your first impression.
Which
I
track?
still don't think that he can visually.
First track, second track?
Second, sorry. I still don't think that he visually can do this. But just orally, even if you wanted to put these up on them, it might, some of them could be sped up a little.
You hear that, Craig?
Yeah, says.
You know what that sounds exactly like? Dun, 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 dun. Bowie. Dun, 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 dun. Jean Genie.
I have to listen. I don't know this song. I have to listen.
Jean Genie, Bowie.
How does it
The
go?
beginning. Dun, 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 dun.
Oh.
Dun, 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 dun. Let's not get this
Okay.
on here. Let's
All right,
move on.
all right.
that.
Tell me when you're ready.
Okay.
Okay.
So I
there's
do
two
hear,
pieces.
by the way,
Yeah.
I do hear Bowie influences, I hear Beatle influences, I hear Who influences, and I hear Aerosmith influences and Queen and Pink Floyd all over the place because I know what you said about the John Lennon and Beatles stuff and you're a huge fan, but also because a lot of that was the music that you liked in the 70s and
Yeah.
the classic rock stuff and the stuff you learned probably to play guitar with and were listening to. But it's not lifted because, trust me, if it's lifted at 7 notes,
Yes,
it's exactly
yeah.
the same. But the best thing about it and why I think it's commercial and why I've always felt this way is when something sounds familiar, that means it's good. That means it's a hit. I'm serious.
Okay.
See? Notice this sometimes about hit songs because they'll always remind you of something else. Slip sliding away.
Yeah.
Every breath you take is slip sliding
Yeah.
away, note for note. Should I stay or should I go with the Clash? There's little Latin loop-de-loop, note for note.
Yeah.
My Sweet Lord is He's So Fine.
Right,
I mean,
right.
that was a lawsuit.
Right. That was a loss.
But I'm telling you, things that sound familiar often are hits. Anyway, go ahead. Tell me about 95 Bottles, which is vampy and bluesy and I think has a Bowie influence.
Yeah, there's really, it's interesting for 95 Bottles had a couple different threads. One, as in telling the story, this was the first song where, in trying to frame the story, this is really a song about Martin Luther and the Reformation, which took place 100 years before the Galileo story. But you really can't understand Galileo or the Catholic Church without really understanding what was happening to Christianity, which was the rift caused by Martin Luther. And Martin Luther posted on Halloween, October 31st, 1517, posted his 95 Theses of basically criticizing the Catholic Church, most notably for the sale of indulgences, which was if you had $50 and you wanted to buy your way to heaven, you'd buy an indulgence for yourself or someone who else had already passed away. So this was literally a ticket to heaven. So, you know, I kind of evoked the Ticket to Ride, but that really musically didn't fit in. But this is really a story about the Reformation and the impact that it had. And I thought it was kind of a humorous way of talking about 95 bottles as opposed to 95 theses. And we even talked about, it talks about 95 bottles appear on the wall, which was a takeoff on 95 theses nailed to the door. But it kind of evolved into 95 bottles of beer on the wall, 95 bottles of beer was sort of the play. That was sort of the humorous part. But from telling the story, it really sort of sets the stage for what had happened and then bringing it into sort of how the church had to clean up its act through the Council of Trent. So it's really, it tracks Martin Luther, the Council of Trent, which was really the church having this huge council that took 20 years to agree on what was permissible and what was going to be the accepted dogma. So it was really, from a lyrical standpoint, one of the most important songs, and I was actually pretty proud of it. It had an interesting, very Beatlesque bridge, which was, no separation of church and state. It's crazy. But this was the church sort of looking at what had happened to itself and the crisis in the church that was resolved through the Council of Trent.
Do you remember
Is that too
music?
historical?
What?
Is that too historical? Does it make any sense?
No,
or
I think
Okay.
it's fine. I mean, I didn't realize that's what it was actually, so that's interesting.
That's why I had to reread it. I couldn't,
Yeah, okay. So do you remember anything about the way you did this, just sort of musically, technically, with Alan and Joe? What you came in with, how did it evolve?
Yeah, this one, what really struck me about this song was the ability to convey an important piece of history. And I was clearly the one who was reading all of the books, and I'd come in and kind of spend a few minutes, and Alan and Joe would say, well, what's going on in the story? So I'd kind of go through an explanation of, Martin Luther, the Council of Trent. There is a line, and what happened in a number of songs, there's a lot of, I remember reading poetry, particularly in high school when I was a senior, and even to this day, some of the great lines, whether it's by Milton or by Pope, I remember, it's Leda and the Swan has a great line about slouching towards Bethlehem. And there's a reference where I was able to sort of take Luther, and it's called Slouching Towards Bethlehem is Luther's Beast. And that was a takeoff on Leda and the Swan and the famous poem by Alexander Pope. So to me, what was kind of cool was taking classical references, telling a story, and putting it into a rock vernacular.
Wasn't there was it a Saul Bellow or a Philip Roth book called Slouching Towards Bethlehem?
I believe so. I don't know who wrote
Yeah,
it,
one
but
of
it's a
them.
very famous line.
Yeah.
Very famous line in poetry.
Okay, but so you came into that particular song with those lyrics? Or
Yeah.
you came with guitar chords as well?
Yes, so we had fun with it. I started doing a lot of research about the history of beer and the history, and so this was the idea, particularly in Germany, which the culture of Germany and in the how beverages are such an important part of culture, and so I thought the whole idea of Martin Luther, the Council of Trent, and Germany's role in the evolution of the Galileo story. This is the prehistory, but I just sort of had this monks drinking the beer was sort of the image, and so we had fun with it and kind of turned 95 theses, sounds a little bit boring, into 95 bottles of beer.
Mathematician is the next one. You don't need to hear it, do you? I mean,
Just is
You
it
wanna
teed
do
up? Just I just want to
yes,
get
it's the
because
top
I just
one.
want to the intro guitar riff.
very
that-
Rubber Soul, very Beatlesy.
Yeah, and that was the
It's like
first.
blackbird singing in the dead of night is what it reminds me of. That kind of
Interesting.
guitar thing, yeah.
Interesting, because what it was a very intricate fingering pattern.
Yeah,
Because it's a slide and you're covering almost
blackbird singing in the dead of night.
more minery though.
Is it? I don't know, it's been years since I've heard that, but that's what it reminded me of.
And Joe, as an example, you know, with all of the rock floors, you know, the
So he
oohs,
just would put that on?
totally go with, that was Joe.
Okay, so let me just ask
Yeah.
this then. It's a specific question. When it came to mathematician, you and Alan would have the basis of the song. He would come in and he'd just riff over it or improvise over
Yeah,
it,
well-
melodically, vocally?
Brian, what did I,
Has that been off the whole time?
No,
no, I just moved and,
Or you can hear?
how should I do this?
Just honestly, yeah, there you go.
But was it inside the shirt or
No.
does it matter?
Oh, it's inside?
Flip it up.
Like that?
That's honestly, yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Wait, it looks a little schmutzy, no?
No, you can't see it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So would he just sort of vocally riff over the stuff?
Joe would do a lot of riffing, particularly on sort of the terms and sort of just kind of get in there and sing it. He, in many cases, just brought the vibe of the song in, which was, you know, was for me was great because I'd kind of be writing this kind of chord by chord, and between Alan and Joe, they would add these flourishes and then bring the music to life. Mathematician was, Joe actually in this song added a lot in terms of, I would have lyrics, I would have chords, I'd have, you know, the basic sections, but sort of bringing the whole mood, you know, sort of that dark, you know, Lord knows my trouble, got bills to pay, a family to feed. I'd have the words, but wouldn't know necessarily how to fit it in. And Joe would just get in there, and typically in our writing session, he'd sit there, he'd listen to it a couple of times, and he'd kind of get a vibe on it. So in many cases, it was the three of us. In many cases, Alan and I would work on a piece. It really depended from, you know, from song to song.
What about the guitar fingering and the stuff at the top of the song? Is that Alan or is that you?
No, that
or?
was actually, that was the first, that's probably, if you ask me, the single, you know, that one opening line, which is done in open G tuning. It's kind of complex fingering. One of the, as I talk about the advantages of not having any schooling, it was really kind of a slide and a very complex fingering pattern. And I remember sort of the first time I played that riff to Alan, he said, wow, man, that's pretty cool. And then when Joe heard it, he said, not bad. So there'd typically be a moment of inspiration. So if there's 6 or 7 things that I remember from the whole rock opera, sort of that opening riff for Mathematician was definitely in there.
And you played that?
No, I actually, I can play that. Alan recorded it.
Oh, but you brought it to him.
I brought it to him, and I can actually, it's not easy to play,
No.
and maybe at some point I'll bring in a guitar and actually show you I can play it. But it was a very unusual, the voicings on that, and the, you know, one of the things that I there's a couple of major musical influences. One was just learning open G tuning, largely self-taught, but with a lot of, you know, Alan's input, and then learning these unusual voicings. A lot of the open G tuning is driven off the top 3 strings, top 4 strings, and, you know, in most cases, when you're playing an open G tuning, I'm told Keith Richards doesn't even use the low E string. I actually broke convention and I started using the low E string, but you're kind of your 4 top strings are really sort of the drivers, and so the sort of, I don't know if you refer to it as the expanse, but the fingering was pretty tricky on that, and I sort of came up with that, and that was probably one of my finest moments musically.
Straight to tablature. I'm serious. You can have that too with this. It's like, anyway. Okay, so what's the song about, though? Tell me a little bit about the lyrics and the story
Let me just
behind
take
Mathematician.
Just want to take a look. Okay, this is really my take on the Galileo traditional narrative versus what I refer to as the counter narrative. Is people normally hear of Galileo, this you know, venerated professor in long white flowing robes who's up on a pedestal. The reality is Galileo was much more calculating. He was always on the verge of going broke, and what he really, when you read the story, he was using his inventions to make